Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. I decided for today to talk about world building tips because this is something that I think pops up a lot for novice writers and experienced writers, particularly in fantasy and broader speculative fiction. And if you're like me and you spend some time on writing online spaces, you know that world building tips and ideas and questions come up a lot. And so the goal for today is to talk about the iceberg theory of world building and what that actually means, and how we actually include these pieces of information in our stories without boring the reader. Now you may be asking yourself, but Brandon, what is world building? Well, I'm glad you asked. World building is a rather broad term that encompasses all of the elements that go into creating the setting for your story. Of course, the setting does also affect your characters and your plot and what you generally want to accomplish with a story, but world building is kind of the back end information that helps lay the groundwork for the actual physical and spatial and temporal setting. World building then theoretically applies to all stories of all sizes and all genres. World building can include things that are on regular Earth, a hidden world on Earth, a completely made up secondary world. Really, it's just up to you. Of course, if your setting is on Earth, you have a lot less world building to do, because if you look around, the world is already built for you. And so when it comes to real Earth world building, especially if it's set in the modern time, you really don't have to do too much world building. You're really just establishing a place, a time, etc. For example, the novel by my friend Rebecca McKenna, Don't Forget the Girl, is set in Iowa. If you're not from the US, Iowa is one of the 50 states. It's considered to be part of the Midwest, even though it's kind of the center of the country. And there's a lot of farmland, a lot of corn. We kind of have a lot of rural flat areas in the Midwest in general. Realistically then, the only world building Rebecca had to do was make sure that we knew where in Iowa it was taking place, at the university primarily, and at what point in time the three different POVs were taking place. When you have a secondary world or a hidden world within Earth, there's gonna be a lot more legwork to do. A really good and common and possibly cliched example, of course, is Brandon Sanderson. All of his Cosmere works take place on various secondary worlds that he's created. They're all very rich and imaginative and well realized, with Roshar being kind of the crown jewel of that. For those not familiar with the Stormlight Archive, Roshar is a world with a supercontinent called Roshar as well, where the vast majority of life forms are crustaceous because they have evolved that way to withstand the world-sweeping hurricanes that come through every so often. Could be a couple days, could be a couple weeks. They kind of don't know, but that's their weather prediction, sort of like we have meteorologists here. And so when you have a world like that, where everything is a vastly different life form from what we have here on Earth, there does have to be a lot more legwork built into the story to get the reader to understand what kind of world you're presenting. And so I think the crux of the issue then is that a lot of inexperienced, newer writers want to throw all their world building information directly up front for the reader, because the theory is that if the reader has all that knowledge right up front, the story will obviously make much more sense. But unfortunately, that's rarely the case. Think of world building as reading the Wikipedia article background about a topic, whereas the actual story is if you went and read one of those primary sources. And when you're looking for a primary source, in this case, the actual story going on in the book, you're not wanting the Wikipedia article, you want the actual book. And that's where the iceberg comes into play. So obviously common pieces of world building include your physical setting, your temporal setting, so where and when is it taking place. Whether it's Earth or a made up world, there might be religions present in the story. If there are, you might decide that you have 2, you might have decided you have 100. It kind of depends on the scope of your story. Money is a really obvious piece of world building because the type of currency a planet or country or kingdom uses is going to inform a lot about the characters and potentially the plot. To use Sanderson as an example again, with money specifically, he ties currency into his magic systems in several books. In Stormlight Archive, gemstones are used to house stormlight that the magic users can suck into them, but the gemstones are also the currency, and when they're filled with stormlight, they are actually more valuable than if they are done, D-U-N, meaning empty of stormlight. Like Stormlight Archive, Mistborn also uses currency as part of the magic system, but in a different way. The currency is still basically metal coins like we would know, kind of your quintessential, copper, silver, gold pieces. And our protagonist, Vin, comes from a very poor street urchin background. Her mom and brother died when she was young. There's a lot of backstory there. Just read Mistborn, it's great. Then when she starts training as a Mistborn with her mentor, Kelsier, or Kelsier, if you were to pronounce it in universe, when he drops a copper coin, the cheapest denomination, on the ground to use as part of his magic, she is baffled because she can't conceptualize throwing away money. And it builds to a beautiful juxtaposition then in the second book when she also starts using coins as part of her fighting style. Those two examples then are a perfect way to bring money into your book, into your setting, individualize it to a society, and then talk about how that informs the character that we're following. Now, I know society itself is a broad term. Obviously, a society includes the money, the religion, the clothing, but this is kind of also thinking just a broader term. What are common jobs in the types of region that you're writing about? Are there gender roles? Are there roles based on sex, on religion, on status in society? Is the societal status based on religion? Is it based on heritage? Is it based on direct lineage, money? It's up to you. And clothing is a really important one because it can help distinguish different types of regions and cultures. You might have a very bright, vivid culture, and then you might have a very dark, gloomy culture, and you might be able to use those colorations to define those cultures, whether they kind of fit with our preconceived notions, or if you are kind of inversing things and making it where the dark, gloomy colors are actually representative of like a very festive area and all the bright colors are actually super depressed. And with the iceberg then, this is the big reminder, is that the story is only going to include so much of your world building. Because your iceberg, this is the whole thing. This is all the world building you've done that includes all of these details. But the reader doesn't need about 80 to 90% of the world building. So that's why I have the giant chunk of the iceberg labeled as background and author knowledge, and I have the top labeled as story and reader knowledge. Because the reader is only going to need 10 to 20% of your world building knowledge to continue through the story and have the story make sense. A good example of a story necessary world building piece is basically back up to these. What are the visual sensations that you can create? Anything that is based on the standard traditional 5 senses is going to help root you and the reader in the world that you want to create. Then you as the author might have a lot more background information for yourself that will help inform you as you create these things and define your characters and your plot. Now, you may be thinking, golly, that's a lot of world building to do for no one to read. It is, but I have a secret for you. The secret is that you don't actually do all this world building. You only do this much world building. One of the most important things to remember as a writer is that you are creating illusions that are believable enough for the reader to be satisfied. All your background information and world building operates on the same principle. You only need enough so that the reader is satisfied and continues to have questions. The world building that you're doing in the story itself, the reader should come away with a really good grasp on. It should also connect to all the background information, but just in a very light way. You don't want to give them a whole big chunk like that. You want to give sparse little details that make them continue to be interested and ask more questions, even while they're discovering the parts that you want them to have right up front. And that's the balance that you have to make as a writer, is giving them enough details to make them interested, but not to bore them. The other thing to remember is that the story has to be rooted in what the reader is experiencing, not what you as the author are conceptualizing while putting words on the page. And that is a really difficult gap to cross. Again, if you're like me at all, you started off as a reader and then became an author. So you know as a reader what should be on the page, but you don't know yet as an author what to actually follow through with, or what is going to be thrown away, what doesn't work, what needs to be rewritten, etc. And all you can do is practice. I think this takes a lot of time to figure out the balance that you can do personally. Everyone's style and voice is different, so whatever you develop in the way that you like to tell stories is also going to determine how much world building you even need to do, what kind of world you're set in, what kind of characters and themes do you want to tackle. And that means that balancing how much information you give right up front, the dreaded info dump, versus how much information you thread throughout the story is going to be defined also by the genre and the scope of the story. And a good way to make sure that you're not info dumping is to put your world building information on the screen, so to speak, page, as your characters encounter it, rather than prepping the reader for when the characters encounter it. But also keep in mind that when you do introduce these types of things through your characters, you don't have to over-explain. Depending on what kind of story and characters you're working with, if you have a character who's from let's say the United States. The story takes place in Iowa. Assuming a pretty Midwestern audience as kind of the core, they'll probably know what the money, the clothing, religion, society, all that is like. Now imagine if you were in that setting and you had two characters encounter each other and both are fully aware of the societal norms. They wouldn't greet each other by explaining the background on their money or their clothing or Christianity, if we're talking the Midwest, let's be real, and other societal norms. I apply that then to my characters and my storytelling, even though it's in a secondary world. I generally write in a tight third-person limited perspective. I do some head hopping throughout the book, but I try to have like 4 or 5 POV characters maximum. And with the tight third-person limited, I then only describe these things, whether through character dialogue or just the internal narration, when it's actually relevant to the POV character. Now, a lot of fantasy tends to start off with some kind of stranger or group of strangers arriving to the main town or city. And that's just a common tradition, not just from Tolkien, but throughout history and myths as well. The wise stranger, wise mentor showing up on the main character's doorstep and helping provide the call to adventure is just a well-beloved trope, and I'm glad for it. Because I did the same thing in my book, which makes it convenient because then you can have your actual main character describe if there are any differences between the stranger's appearance and their own appearance. And those two characters can then interact with each other and deliver some information in a casual conversation that is still informative for the reader. Really, you just want to avoid what we call maid and butler dialogue. That is from the stage tradition, wherein you might have a maid and a butler come out onto the stage at the very beginning to explain the current situation that we are finding ourselves in. The reason it's bad to do that is because the maid and the butler in the scene, in the universe of the play, would already be aware of the information. So once again, it's bizarre that they would come out and start telling each other the situation that they already know. I just want to reiterate that you want to give information to the reader when the character in the story encounters it and makes it relevant. And that means you can go light on certain details. If you say the buildings in your city are made out of red bricks and white slate roofs, that's a pretty broad description, but a lot of people will get a general description and they can fill in the rest with their own imagination. And I think that's actually a big part of effective world building, is leaving enough wiggle room to let the reader continue to expand and expound upon things. That's why the words of Brandon and the conventions and the live streams are all really popular amongst his readers. It lets the fans interact with the author and ask questions that they've come up with based on the world building, which is proof yet again that he's a good author. I know he's oversaturated, I'm sorry. Now at the end of the day though, what I want to draw attention to is that it should always be fun to come up with the stuff. I mean, the whole story should be fun, but the stuff at the bottom is going to be especially wacky and silly if you want to, because you don't actually have to explain it to anybody. This would be the Wikipedia article, whereas this is the primary source. This is the Silmarillion, this is the Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings. And if you think that you need to be like Tolkien to write effectively, I've got bad news for you. The only reason Tolkien is held up to high esteem today is because of the way that he essentially invented the genre. However, the majority of LOTR enjoyers these days have positive memories based upon the movies rather than the books. And I think it's just become expected in online spaces that people say, oh, Tolkien has such beautiful writing, yada yada, but then you find out they didn't actually read the books. So my point isn't that Tolkien is bad. Tolkien's obviously great. My point is that you don't actually have to spend 20 years creating a language and then a whole mythology around it in order to write a story. In fact, if you are doing that, I think you're wasting your time. And I know that's kind of unusually harsh for this channel, but really, it's not worth doing that anymore because we're not in that landscape anymore. Tolkien's prose, frankly, would not be publishable today because there's not a lot of people who prefer that way anymore. And the other piece of irony that would hold Tolkien back in the modern publishing world is that his fantasy is obviously now considered cliched. The elves and dwarves that he popularized are kind of the quintessential elves and dwarves. Dungeons and Dragons uses them, Aragon uses them, Aragon uses a lot of people's ideas, Elder Scrolls uses them, and so on and so forth. And I know that's kind of weird to say that Tolkien's influence would negatively influence Tolkien today, which is the truth. and that's why no one should seek to emulate him. Now, this is all coming from the perspective of someone who wants to publish. So if you are not wanting to publish and you are truly just writing for the joy of writing, which should always be your very first instinct, having fun and writing for yourself is truly the most important thing. So if spending 20 years constructing a whole new language and then creating a mythos around it appeals to you, do it. But if your goal is to get published, especially with a traditional publisher, the story is always going to have to come first. So this is why you shouldn't worry about having all your world building figured out prior to completing the story, because I think the story development should actually inform how the world building develops. And that's why I also recommend writing down every single change that you make. If you have prepped for something in the background information that no longer works because of a decision you made in the story, it would behoove you to change that element in the background so that you don't have to abandon the scene that you're liking in the mainline story. But anyway, to reiterate, the important part is, are you having fun doing it? If spending 20 years doing Silmarillion type stuff appeals to you, go for it. If you want to get published, start with a story, worry about world building in detail later. I think that's enough for today, so I'm gonna call it there. If you are wondering what's going on over here, I just got a little carried away with my markers earlier and drew some birds and an octopus wanting to fist fight a shark. You're welcome. If you liked the video, please be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. I'm interested in hearing anyone's thoughts about all of this, and please do ask questions. I would love to explain further on all of these different details. As always, thanks for stopping by. I hope that you have a wonderful day, and I will see you here in the next video.